Following his good example, then I'll stay on the English wavelength. Okay, so I want to thank you in the first place for the invitation. It's a great honor for us. And I bring you greetings from the CAPP for the promotion of integral human development. We rushed in because we introduced this morning into office the newly elected Secretary General of Caritas. They had a meeting, as you know, last week, and they have a new Secretary General whom we introduced into office this morning. That's why I wasn't here at the beginning, but counting on your understanding. So briefly introducing the Laudato Si and its challenges to the world these days, knowing that there will be a keynote address after this. Just feel like starting with this observation, which was made by one Indian scientist in a periodical called Science. He says, humanity is at a crossroads. Finding ways to develop a sustainable relationship with nature requires not only engagement of scientists and political leaders, but also moral leadership, and that religious institutions are in a position to offer. So that's why we're following Pope Francis. So the transformational steps may well be a massive mobilization of public opinion by the Vatican, started already with the publication of Laudato Si, but with which the Pope invites all of us to a change of conduct and a change of paradigm in our relationship with creation and nature. So that's what this is. Now, the basic areas that, in the light of this conference, where the challenges are coming from, since the publication of the encyclical in 2015, are still there. We identify the challenges as coming from partly from the scientific community. It's massively in support of the encyclical, but still we have discussions still remaining. Then also in the political arena, we do verify some challenges and resistance to this. Then also by the economic and business community, we do also have challenges that come from there, which we can discuss. And in the area of education, people's awareness about what is happening, what is involved in the encyclical, and the need to be knowledgeable about the forces at stake. And then also by faith communities, which for various reasons find a reason to resist this. So these are 5 key areas of challenges, which I'll briefly mention. But to situate what I'm about to say, these challenges, as you know, Laudato Si began with the first public act of Pope Francis. Right after his election as a Pope, he had to celebrate and preside over the Mass of St. Joseph, 19th of March. And at that Mass, the Pope Francis was sharing a reflection about the role of St. Joseph as the guardian, as the custodian, as it were, of the Holy Family. And he expanded that concept to inviting humanity to also exercise the same care that Joseph had for the family, for the creation and poor. So from that first instance, know that he had chosen the name of Francis, elected as a pope, and the first public activity about St. Joseph, he had extended the care that St. Joseph exercised to all humanity about the poor and creation. From this inspiration developed the project about doing an encyclical on the care for creation. So right after that, in the private audience with our dicastery, he suggested that he wanted to do an encyclical on creation and nature. And so I said, when can we come together to discuss the various main lines? No, you begin to write. And so our dicastery tried to put together a draft, which went to him in July, and then he worked on that, and finally we have an encyclical, Care for Our Common Home. Briefly, the points where there should really be no challenges derive from an attempt to also capture the crucial features of the encyclical. Mine will be very brief. There will be a keynote after this, so I'll be very brief. Now, for all of you gathered here, certainly you've read the encyclical and all of that. I'd like to draw attention to 7 characteristics of the encyclical, which may be a key guide for the discussion and everything that may follow. The encyclical, its teaching about integral ecology, is a teaching in continuity with other popes. So the first C characteristic of the encyclical is continuity. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis is teaching in continuity with popes before him. Integral ecology is understood as everything is connected, everything is interconnected and all. But integral ecology also means that it's not only natural ecology, it is natural, it is human, it is social, and so peace. Now, natural ecology was first thrown out by Pope Paul VI in Populorum Progressio. When talking about the development of people, drew our attention to the need for a balance between development and natural resources and how we protect them. So that's the first time the idea about natural ecology came up. Pope John Paul II took up natural ecology and expanded it and added human ecology to it. So at the time of Pope Francis, Centesimus Annus is from there, we speak not only about natural ecology, but we speak about natural and then human ecology. Then Pope Benedict expanded it further and added social ecology, ecology of peace, and even that of culture. So at the inception of the pontificate of Pope Francis, we've had ecology presented as natural, human, social, peace, and culture. All of that put together, if you want to describe what we may call integral ecology. Ecology which is not just natural, but which is also human, which is social, which is... So that is a way. So in that sense, the teaching about integral ecology is a teaching in continuity with popes before Francis. Another feature of a Laudato Si is the thing about its collegiality. Popes in teachings refer to what other popes have said. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis does not only refer to what other popes have said, but what other bishops' conferences are saying. So in Laudato Si, there's a reference to what the United States Bishops' Conference have said, what the Canadian Bishops' Conference have said, what the South African Bishops' Conference has said, what the Philippinian Bishops' Conference has said, what the Irish Bishops' Conference. So the Pope cites a lot the teaching of other episcopal conferences on ecology, as if he's teaching with the bishops around the world. That's what we call a collegiality. And for us, this means that if the Pope, in writing this encyclical, used so much the data of episcopal conferences, then when the encyclical is written, bishops must come on board in their application and the diffusion of the encyclical. That is the nature of collegiality. Collegiality does not simply refer to the Pope referring to bishops in writing, but once it's written, bishops must come on board in promoting the content and the knowledge of encyclical. This is also important because in several places we go talking about Laudato Si, the question we get is, but why are our bishops and priests not telling us about this? Collegiality requires that the bishops come on board also with, promoting the knowledge of the encyclical. So that's the second C. The third C is about conversation or dialogue, if you want. Right from the beginning of the encyclical, Pope Francis says, come, let us talk together. Let us... Already? No. That's not me. So the Pope says, so let us talk together. We face a global situation, but let us talk together. So dialogue or conversation is a crucial part, it's a crucial exercise of this encyclical. Okay, because the Pope affirms the crisis, but then he says the human beings have the disposition to, overstep the crisis, talking together and coming to chat together. So the third C is that of a conversation, if you want, or dialogue about the crisis, about what we face. And dialogue goes through the encyclical. It's an appeal that Pope Francis makes to talk. So his own confession is that the biggest challenge he had was evaluation of the scientific data for the writing of the encyclical. He wanted to dialogue with science, but how to evaluate the scientific data was a big challenge, for him. And happily, we have that with a reference to the UN, okay, UN climate scientists and all of that. Yet, 4 years after the encyclical, we still have scientists who come to our office and still express objection. Somebody came and said, but all the UN scientists are all chemists. We need real physicists in this and this thing. And then so we say that if you have any point of view, publish, so you get a peer review of your position. So that's how we deal with some of the scientific objections. You have a position, publish it. And then let's see what peer review you get of the positions that you have to promote all of this. So after the thing about conversation, then it's what? We converse about what? We converse about care for creation. That's the core task of the encyclical, care for creation. Mine should not be keynote, so I should not speak too much. Care for creation for us is very interesting. This is coming from the Old Testament, and may be interesting for you about the sense of care for creation. Hitherto, we've had there was a lot of talk about stewardship of creation. Stewardship is not what Pope Francis, he uses that only once in Laudato Si. Otherwise, the relationship between the humanity and environment is expressed in terms of a care. Now, care, and the word used, if you want, from it, whatever translations, refers to basically an episode in the Old Testament. After Cain had killed his brother Abel, God asked him, "Where is your brother?" And the answer was that, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And the word used over there is shomer. Am I the caretaker or caregiver of my brother? And it's the same expression which is used about our relationship with creation, as if our care for creation is like a care for a brother. So the intimacy of relationship called for far exceeds that of stewardship, of taking charge of something. It's almost like a familiar relationship. The type of thing which St. Francis later on would express in his Canticle of Creation. Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Mother Earth, and all of that. So the relationship between humanity and the environment is very, very intimate, as if it's like a familiar relationship expressed in the sense of a care for creation. So that is the fourth C. Now, how do we care for creation in the midst of crisis? Pope Francis will say convert. Conversion is a response from us to the need to care for creation. That is a subject matter that you want to discuss these few days. Conversion, the change. And he suggests so very many for whatever. The last one, interesting one, small ones, is his reference to St. Teresa of Avila, and it's not about little things. Converting or changing in response to a climate thing does not always involve big things. Pope Francis refers to St. Teresa of Avila, to the saint of little things, to suggest that our response to the need to change can take the form of little practice, little activities, all of which express our own willingness to respond to the need to change our attitude towards creation. So conversion is a crucial word in this encyclical. Then Holy Father Pope Francis goes on to say that conversion sometimes requires motivation. People sometimes need to be helped to convert, need to be convinced about the need to convert, and the source of convincing people is education. Education in ecological citizenship. So ecological citizenship, according to Pope Francis, is the subject matter of the education that helps and needs people to convert. People need to be helped to recognize that they're part of creation. And being part of creation and connected with its element, he would say that our bodies are drawn from the elements of the earth, and our lives are sustained by the elements of creation, by the food, by the air, by the water. Our life depends inextricably with that of creation. So ecological citizenship and education in that is what Pope Francis proposes as a motivation for conversion. They need to converse, education, ecological citizenship. And the seventh and the last C I like to talk about, therefore, is after all of this, ecological citizenship, then he talks about contemplation. Creation leads to contemplate the good things God has created. Already, those who used to pray with the Psalms, you remember Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaim the handiwork of God," and all of that. So creation in a real way reveals God to us. And in revealing God to us, helps us also to contemplate God in what he has created. So contemplation which leads, for example, the church to worship with the elements of creation, the bread of the Eucharist, the wine of the Eucharist. All of those are drawn from the elements of creation. So contemplation and prayer in the style of St. Francis of Assisi is the seventh C that we can talk about. So with these 7 C's, you have a quick shot through the encyclical. Recognize the different main characteristics which can become the key in whatever you have to do. Now, based on this, the quest for about how concretely to respond to the encyclical, the challenges that it addresses is what you guided to look at. And for us, the challenges can be at least 5 levels. Okay, which I talked about. Some comes from the scientific community. Okay, and in that case, the doubt that is expressed sometimes also here. We talk about Pacific Islands and the rise of sea level, and even a cardinal will say to me, but it's also possible that the land mass itself is sinking. So it's not sea level, from the melting of ice, but it's also possible that the land mass itself tectonically is also sinking. So you still come across that. You still come across that. And when that is the case, then the appeal of Pope Francis, when he says, "Listen to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth," it's not to rationalize about what can be the cause, but to look at what is happening to part of the humanity now. It can be the land sinking or it can be sea levels rising. But what is the experience for humanity? Part of your brothers are suffering. Some have to migrate, leave their islands, buy island space elsewhere. So it is the suffering situation, the need for compassion that sometimes stimulates the concern that we need to have. Another area that we have challenges coming from are with the political thing, the political will. Okay, politicians and the political will to respond to this. CAPP 21 has come and gone. And we celebrate it every year with CAPP 22, CAPP 23, CAPP 24. Now the last one at Katowice was CAPP 24. And we're preparing for CAPP 25. It's a question of political will. Everybody tells you that the money is there in the world. But then why is it not? Why are we not concretely engaging to do things? The political will sometimes is missing. And because the thing is possible, but the political will is missing, that's why the thing also becomes ethically very grievous. Because the possibility of doing or solving the problems, you do fine. And, that political will is there. The political will is oftentimes connected with the economics and business. The challenges of the economics and business, and in that case, it's sometimes a question of, profit, question of revenues and all of that, the interests of shareholders, and then they need to invest. When we do meet some of these people in the area, they tell us about how seriously they're involved in, research about finding alternative solutions to carbon, drawing carbon from the atmosphere and putting them back into the earth and all of that. But that is still the challenge. Some also will tell us that the solution is already there. It is the will to commit to them that is missing. So that challenge is also there for people. And then we can also talk about the thing about the lack of education in lower and higher places. It's often said whenever there's a talk about the climate change that poor countries are the ones who suffer most. I come from Ghana. I go home and the awareness of climate change and everything happening in Europe, a mere fraction, you hardly hear it. It doesn't make the news. It doesn't make the headlines of news in the poor countries which are supposed to suffer most from this. So those who are supposed to suffer most are the ones who are most ignorant or who do not, regularly discuss the issues involved in what is happening. So the need for education, the need for awareness and all of that needs to be heightened and all of that. So I will not leave you with problems. The last thing is about solutions. As a result of this, our own dicastery is working with a group that the first time the encyclical came out and we presented it, decided to take the challenges in the encyclical and propose solutions. So there's a group you may come across every now and then on the internet called Laudato Si Challenge. The Laudato Si Challenge is a group that was born out of one of the seminars or conferences we had on Laudato Si. And the objective was to look at the problems in Laudato Si and try to formulate solutions for them. So the first time the group was formed, 9 identify issues in Laudato Si to which they propose solutions. The challenge of water, potable water for people, the challenge of energy, the challenge of industrial waste, the challenge of nourishment and food protein. So 9 such examples were proposed. Water filters were, the one who came out with water filters, we just used some of his products. When the hurricane hit Mozambique and destroyed things, and there was a problem about cholera, we sent 5,000 of those filters to Mozambique to help them have access to potable, clean water. So that's one solution there. Industrial waste is one. The solar renewable form of energy is one. The other one is protein. And the protein group was a group from Guadalajara in Mexico. They go to breweries and take the waste, the hop and the malt, which come out of breweries, which are supposed to be very rich in protein. They convert that into flour and process it in cake and bread for malnourished countries or places where nourishment is very poor, because I didn't know that. But in breweries, the waste of breweries are supposed to be very rich in protein, and it's processed into food and cake to take care of the protein needs of poorly nourished countries, and so on. So the challenge is on, and ours is not only to talk about it, ours to see whether we can also make concrete proposals, and we'll be glad for whatever suggestions will come from your own assembly in response to Laudato Si and its challenges and problems. Thank you.
Sua Eminenza, che ci ha dato una chiave di lettura estremamente interessante, e questi 7 C sono veramente un punto di partenza, e poi ci ha anche stimolato, secondo me, la curiosità di sapere un po' di più di questo gruppo Laudato Si Challenges, quali sono le soluzioni che sono state trovate. Quindi magari ci terremo in contatto per avere maggiori informazioni, perché questo ci serve anche come per dialogare, insomma, per aprire una collaborazione e vedere se alcune delle proposte che io spero possano emergere da questo nostro incontro si possano integrare con quelle che sono già emerse. Grazie veramente di cuore, grazie Eminenza, grazie. Adesso abbiamo l'intervento del dottor Potocnic, che è il co-chair della United Nations Environmental International Resource Panel. La parola a Janek Potocnic. Grazie.
Thank you. If you can just put the slides on, please. Thank you. Yeah, it's working. Thank you. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I will just explain. No, then I have to go there because I have to run it. Can I go there?
Yeah.
That will be the easiest. Just one sentence before starting with the substance about the International Resource Panel. We are a science policy interface in the area of resource management. You probably know better than us International Panel for Climate Change, which is dealing with the climate, or IPBS, which is dealing with the biodiversity. We are dealing with management of natural resources, and we are kind of sister organizations to the two organizations which I have mentioned. So I will start with our world and some facts about the future risks. And it will be a bit unconventional start, as you will notice. This is the title of one of the famous songs of the Doors, which is saying, "People are strange." And if I would connect to what His Eminency Cardinal Turkson said, it's about conversion and change, but our problem is we want changes, but we don't want to change. And that's pretty much the essence of the problems which we are facing. But let's look to the major challenges of the 21st century. These are basically all the facts which I will state. You have all learned that we will be 9.7, 9.8 billion till mid of the century. And we have got used to that figure. But let me translate that figure to the human language. That means that in 1 year, you will have on the planet additional population of Germany. In 4 years, you will have additional population of United States of America. And in 9 days and 6 hours, you would have population of my country, Slovenia. So that's how quickly it goes. And all that is happening in the least developed part of the world, who has all the right to esteem that they would live in the same way as we do. Which means that the pressure on the future resource use, if we do not fundamentally change, will be enormous and will be unbearable. Social part. Few people own the same as the poorest half of the world. The richest 1% is more wealthy than the rest of the world. 800 million people are hungry. Over 2 billion suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. Over 2 billion people are obese. We throw away 1/3 of the food we produce, which means 1/3 of the land, 1/3 of the water, 1/3 of the energy, 1/3 of the pesticides, everything which we use for the production of that food. If we look to the story of the cities, half of the cities which will exist in 2050, in the mid of the century, have not yet been built. China has used in 3 years, 11 till 13, more cement than United States of America in the whole 20th century. Let's go then to the environmental story. Climate change experts are warning us that we basically have 12 years on the clock if we want to stay inside the 1.5 degrees. 60% of ecosystems are today already degraded or used unsustainably. Biodiversity, according to Living Planet Index, in just last 40 years, we have lost 60% of our biodiversity. 85% of the world fisheries are at or beyond the biological limits. 1/3 of soils is degraded or used unsustainably due to various reasons. 7 million people are dying prematurely globally due to the air pollution. In Europe, approximately 500,000, which is something like 30 times more than in car accidents. And you know exactly about which we speak more. 1 million of plastic bottles are bought every minute globally. 9% of that is recycled, 12% incinerated, and approximately 80% still lands in our nature. We are the first generation more likely to die as a result of lifestyle choices than infectious diseases. Nearly half of the work we do will be able to be automated by the mid of the century. And when I try to explain what does it artificial intelligence brings and what does it mean, you might remember, especially those of you who are chess lovers, that in 1997 Garry Kasparov was in the second attempt beaten by the computer. And that computer was entirely programmed by humans. In 2017, TG, that's the Go champion, and Go, it's much more complicated game than the chess, was beaten by the computer, to which only the data were given, nothing else, data. He learned the game and he beat the human champion. That's the artificial intelligence. So one thing which we should all understand is that for the first time in the history of humanity, we are living in a social ecological system of planetary scope. We are for the first time really interconnected and interdependent. My father was still using a horse to travel from my birth city to the biggest town. Today, trade, economy, internet, transport, name it what you want. So we are thus responsible how we act and how we manage the planet altogether. The Club of Rome has nicely explained it that we have moved from the so-called empty world, which was dominated by nature, to a full world, which is now dominated by humans. In the empty world, it was labor and infrastructure, which were the limiting factors of human well-being, while in the full world, these are natural resources and environmental things. They are the factors of human well-being. So you have probably heard about the definition of so-called safe operating space, which is defined by two factors. One are internal factors, so the internal circle, which is giving you the basic human needs, including minimum requirements of resource supply, and this part is increasing. And then you have the outer part, the outer limit of planetary boundaries. If we are sincere, not all are scientifically well yet defined. But the fact is that this donut, the green part, it's shrinking. And that's actually the area in which we could live in safe operating space. One of the problems which I firmly believe that we have when we deal with the problems is that when we look to this situation, what are the drivers and pressures? And what are the consequences, the states, the impacts? Then we are more or less focusing on climate, biodiversity loss, or pollution, but all those things are in essence consequences. If you want to really address those consequences, you have to go to drivers and pressures. And if you say drivers and pressures, you immediately say humans and human activity. So what we try to do in the International Resource Panel is build a bridge between the economic activity and the consequences in climate and in biodiversity loss. Why that's so important? Because the policies are different, which you then make as a conclusion. I could give you some examples, but unfortunately I don't have time. So if that's true, let's go then and ask ourselves how our economy looks and what is wrong with our economy. I will try to make this story as simplified as possible so that it's better understood. Here in front of you, you have a very nice presentation of development trajectory. On the horizontal axis, you see the HDI, Human Development Index. So more right you are, more developed you are. On the vertical axis, it's environmental footprint. Higher you are, higher it's your footprint, so worse it is. The dots are the countries of the world. And the dots which are surrounded red, you will see them on the right upside corner, are actually European Union countries. So we practically all live well, but far beyond the planetary limits. The green corner on the bottom right-hand side corner contains all the countries where people are living well within the planetary boundaries. So none. What is the real problem? When we develop, we first go up and right, and when we face and see the problems, then we start to go down. What is unfortunate is that, of course, that countries which are on the left-hand side, which are least developed, can simply not theoretically replicate our pattern of development. They cannot. So, but I have to be clear, responsibility for the situation in which we are and for the solutions lies more or less in the hands of developed nations. Because we are those who have to show that we are ready and able to go down, because we still master to a large extent the knowledge and innovation. And that's why it's really important that we understand where we are and act accordingly. So you all know that we are living in market economies. And in market economies, producers and consumers meet on the market. We apparently behave rationally, even if this is pretty irrational because the whole history of humanity, it's actually irrational behavior. So why we would act rationally in economics today? Anyway, we see what we know is that the signals which we are sending on the market through prices are actually those who are deciding where the quantities, where the equilibria will be met. But let us today look at the signals which we are sending to the market. Financial capital, overvalued, over-rewarded. Human capital, undervalued, under-rewarded. Natural capital, in majority of the cases, not valued and not rewarded at all. If somebody expects that we will, through that signals, get a very well-balanced social, economic, and environmental situation, he or she should wake up. It's simply something which is following the signals which we are sending on the market. Mainly, we are saying that economic system should be the function of the ecosystem, so that we should respect the limits which are given to us. And the major problem in that, it's basically linked to the environmental externalities. I was commissioner on European level for 10 years. The last 5 years, I was responsible for environment. I have heard the sentence, you cannot introduce that and that because it's additional costs, many times, believe me. But what it's misunderstood is that those costs are not additional costs. They are existing, but we deny them. We don't calculate them. They are paid either by the health system, they are not paid by consumer and producer, or in majority of the cases, they are paid by the next generation. You know, it's very nice because next generation cannot complain. But even they started to complain now, thank God. So what we do, it's in essence, we privatize the profits and we socialize the cost. And it's very difficult to live like that. If you look to the Inclusive Wealth Index, which has basically 3 components, production capital, human capital, and natural capital. These are the dotted lines which you maybe not see very well. But one conclusion for the last a bit more than 2 decades, by the way, it's based on UN work, also scientific, it's pretty simple. The growth of GDP and social capital in the past decades has been achieved at the cost of depleting natural capital, full stop. So if you want, if I would summarize the current way how we are measuring economic growth through the GDP, my conclusion would be approximately like that. You will not reach the goal by walking faster if you are walking into the wrong direction. And that's unfortunately the situation in which we are today. So it's not the quantity, it's the quality which matters, and sustainable growth, it's something which needs to be taken into account. This is leading us to the resources, the story which I'm covering. Out of 17 SDGs, 12 are directly linked to the resource use, and the rest are indirectly linked to the resource use. And one of the conclusions of the IRP, it's also that it's clearly that trade-offs among reaching different goals are existing. But the best way, if you want to mitigate them, it's via sustainable consumption and production, which means if you want to eradicate poverty, achieve zero hunger, address climate action, and so on, if you do not fundamentally change the economic model, you will not reach the goal. You will not reach the other goals. We have just recently, 2 months ago, published so-called Global Resource Outlook for 2019, which looks to the biomass, fossil fuels, metals, non-metallic minerals, land, and water. I will share with you just few basic conclusions. This is the development in last 50 years. First, global resource use has more than tripled in the last 50 years. It has almost doubled per capita, which means that majority of that growth can be connected with economy, not with the population growth. And finally, which is striking, you might see this black line, it's about resource productivity, which is how efficiently you use resources for production of various goods. It was growing till year 2000. By the way, it's still growing in all the countries, but globally it's falling. How is that possible? Because a lot of the products which you are buying today were before produced in resource-efficient countries like Europe or Japan, and now they are produced in resource-less efficient countries like China, India, Indonesia, and so on. So that structural shift is causing that we are actually using more resources for the same production. Environmental impacts, which we also calculated, were only in a resource extraction and processing use, not in the final use. 90% of the global biodiversity loss and water stress can be connected to that. Majority is connected to biomass. So to translate that sentence, if you want to deal with the questions of biodiversity loss and water, you have to deal with the questions of biomass, or if I'm with how you are producing food and agriculture. Second, 50% of global climate change, it's actually connected to the resource extraction and processing phase, and even 1/3 of the air pollution in the processing and resource extraction, so not use phase. To translate again that sentence in human language, if you buy a car and you park it for the whole life, you have already caused 1/3 of the pollution, because the production of that car was actually polluting so much. So we also look to the distribution, and it's very interesting when we have looked from low-income countries to high-income countries and to in between. And if you look it through domestic material consumption, which is all materials used on your territory being domestically produced or imported, you find out that it's actually already in the high middle income countries, it's growing quicker than in the high income countries. In China, it's growing per capita, it's higher than it's actually in our countries, which is due to the new infrastructure and cities which they are building. But if you add to that where actually those products which they are producing are landing, so the whole consumption phase, then you end up in different kind of conclusion. So material footprint, high-income countries have 13 times higher than low-income countries, which is still a most terrible conclusion. So one thing which is obvious is that if we want to increase the well-being in the future, if we want to have economic growth in the future, that's only possible if we decline our resource use, and if we decouple the resource use from economic growth, and if we decline environmental pressures from well-being and economic growth. Without that, it's not possible. This leads me to the circular economy. Circular economy should be seen as an instrument which is delivering decoupling, as a part of the bigger picture of economic, social, and cultural transformation. It is normally, that's a solution which I'm talking about. It's normally presented by this butterfly of Ellen MacArthur, which is saying that you need to esteem to keep resources in the production and consumption phase as long as possible. You can do it by designing the product differently. You can do it by organizing the production differently, by having the whole system of business model differently. And one thing which people normally do as a mistake is that they believe that recycling is the story of circular economy. Recycling is the worst of the good, because when you recycle, you have already used the resources. Is circular economy a new concept? Actually, it's the oldest concept on the earth, because the whole nature is organized on the principles of circularity. This is why it would make common sense that we humans also embrace it and finally behave accordingly. So in essence, there it's only one question we have to answer. Do we agree that we humans are part of the nature too? And if we would like to answer that question, maybe we would need a bit of a help of most famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. When he was asked why he is speaking about himself always in the third person, he replied something like that. If one is such a genius as myself, it is very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. So it's a bit like humanity would need to act. We need to establish a bit of healthy distance and not act like invasive species. Circular economy, it's also an essential ingredient in the fight against the climate change. Currently, the policies are more or less linked to carbon management and energy, but we need to add also land, water, and materials decoupling. If you would imagine the situation that we have abundant energy, that we have cheap energy, and all renewable energy, but current model of production and consumption, we would not solve the problem of the climate change. So we need three pillars: supply-side solutions, energy carbon management, demand-side solutions, circular economy, land, water, materials management, and of course, nature-based solutions. And if I just mention one example from the demand-side solutions, you know, if you would shift from owning a car to sharing a car, according to the evaluations which we have done, you can save approximately 70% of CO2 emissions. So if you will hear your politicians discussing to make bigger streets in the city, around the city, and so on, just tell them that they should wake up. Rather, they should adopt a decision today. In 15 years, private-owned car will not be allowed in the city, and you will get all the decisions and all the solutions immediately. Finally, about more and less regulation, some are saying that regulation is not important. You know, business needs regulation. What they are afraid is unfairness, free riding, uncertainty. They need predictability and level playing field. The challenge seems not to be one of inadequate scientific evidence anymore, rather the one of cooperation and implementation. Complexity and scale of these challenges require new forms of collaboration and more systemic approaches. That's why we need new ways of global governance, absolutely. We need more to cooperate, share sovereignty, rather than owe sovereignty. And in that context, the best example is exactly European Union. 70 or 80 years ago, we have decided that we try to avoid conflicts and wars. And by the way, if we will not share sovereignty on the global level, we will have conflicts and wars, because that's the alternative. European Union, what would be our role in that context? We can hardly imagine Europe as the center of the world in the future, but we should do everything that Europe remains the center of the dreams of all the people of the world. Finally, to conclude, because it's ringing a bit, which I doubt that it was 20 minutes, the first ring, but whatever. Why and how? Thank you. That's not artificial intelligence, but it's part of that intelligence, yes. In the last 50 years, we actually moved from the limits of growth, which were published by Club of Rome, to more growth of limits. Those best able to cope with those limits should and will be also most competitive, and we need more creative destruction rather than destructive creation. Main points to remember. We need a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation that includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affects all of us. Degree of human intervention, often in the service of business interest and consumerism, is actually making our Earth less rich and beautiful. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in deterioration of the environment. But this is just the sign of the reductionism which affects every aspect of human and social life. Independence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. We urgently need a humanism capable of bringing together different fields of knowledge, including economics, the service of more integral and integrated vision. I suggest that we now consider some elements of integral ecology. Probably you have noticed that I was a bit playing with you. These are the quotes from Encyclica. These are not the conclusions of my presentation, but you probably see how well they are fitting. Why we are not changing faster? There are basically, I think, three major reasons. First, all political cycles, public financial institutions have inbuilt short-term focus and logic. And that's a real problem. I was 20 years in politics and I haven't been included in one serious strategic debate. Second, production and consumption systems are based on the logic of consumerism, fueled by growth-based quantities and measured by the GDP. We don't define risks well, and we don't manage them very well. And third, transition to a more sustainable economy and society will only be possible if it's just, fair, inclusive, and we are currently failing to deliver. We need more equitable societies. We need more fight against poverty. Social unrest is growing even in high-income countries like France, and we see the frustrated young generation on the streets. Greta Thunberg, it's not a symbol of the awakened young generation. Thank God they have awakened and thank God we have it. But she's a symbol of the failure of our generation. We have to fix a broken compass. In essence, that means the development of new economic model. Changes are unavoidable and humans are supposed to be intelligent. It's high time to prove it. SDGs should be the northern star guiding our policies and behavior, and what would be utmost needed, it's a new intergenerational agreement, a program for the future generations which would put sustainability first. Social, economic, and environmental at the same time. These are the last two quotes on the last two slides. The first one, it's from the one you know. The second one, it's from the one you will not know. Albert Einstein was once asked why mankind stretched so far to discover the structure of the atom, but we have not been able to devise the political means to keep the atom from destroying us. And he replied, that is simple, my friend. It's because politics is more difficult than physics. Unfortunately, the story which I was sharing with you is the story of physics. So we are denying the physical laws, but the decisions are in the hands of the politicians. We talked before about the leadership. Don't wait for the leadership. Be the leaders. Be the leaders on your level where you are working, because that's the way how we will change the world. And the final quote, if you will need to persuade somebody about the things which I was sharing with you, use the quote of Professor Guy McPherson from Arizona University. If you think the economy is more important than the environment and health, try holding your breath while counting your money. Thank you.